Okay, I think we're ready to begin. Can everyone hear me? All right. So firstly, I want to thank everyone for coming today. This is a great turnout given the circumstances, and I know that for some of you the trip was probably a little difficult, so I'm really pleased to see you all here. Welcome to New America. My name is Chris Mellon. I'm a policy analyst with the Future of Property Rights program, and I'm going to be the moderator tonight. My role will be to try not to impede the flow of information coming from our panel of experts today. So I want to give a special thanks to them, to Frank Patel of Cadastres, Anne Malarisi of the Radiant Earth Foundation, and Walter Folkman of Microaerial Projects. I'll let them introduce themselves briefly after my opening remarks and say a little bit about what they do. We're here today to discuss the advent of cheap, high-accuracy geospatial technology, specifically GNSS receivers. And today we're launching a new report called Accuracy for All, Community Land Mapping and the Navigation Satellite Revolution. What we're interested in at FPR is formalization surveying, helping people map their land and register it to get access to financial services and to increase the security of their tenure. That is a chronic issue worldwide, and there simply aren't enough professional surveyors to map all of this land. We always like to invoke an infographic from the Cadastres Foundation that illustrates this point extremely well, which is, I think in Uganda there are a total of 74 registered land surveyors and several million unregistered parcels. And by your estimates, it would take about 1,000 years for them to map all of that land using conventional methods.
And assuming no more transactions in the next 1,000 years.
There you go. Unlikely, I think we can agree. So it gives you a sense of what is at stake here. So in this paper, we discussed the democratization of access to highly accurate GNSS positioning technology and how that might impact community land mapping. This is a culmination of about a year of research and work on GNSS, which was sparked really by Walter. And I'll also let him kick off when we start here in a moment. But the basic thesis that's being explored here is that formalization surveying shouldn't compromise accuracy, and that dual-frequency GNSS receivers are crucial tools for accurate surveying, and that for reasons we'll get to shortly, they will soon, for the first time, be affordable for people who are not professional surveyors. That is to say, this technology is already appearing in consumer electronic devices. In our first article on this subject, which came out in, I think, March of 2017, we made a prediction saying that the price of a dual-frequency receiver would fall exponentially, as it had been doing already, to less than $50 per unit within the next 5 years. And that turned out to be woefully conservative, because by, I believe, March in 2018, I forget the exact month, the Xiaomi Mi 8 was released. This is a smartphone produced in China, which incorporates a dual-frequency GNSS chip, which is far more accurate than anything that's appeared in a consumer electronic device before. And that, as far as we can deduce, contributed virtually nothing to the cost of the device. It's being produced at such scale that may have been $1 or something, like the current single-frequency chip you have in your iPhone. And the entire phone costs about $400. So in other words, Walter's basic thesis that the accuracy of consumer GNSS devices is converging towards that of professional-grade devices isn't quite here yet, but we're starting to see this uncoupling of the accuracy of surveying and the cost of surveying, which promises to be revolutionary for community land mapping and for property rights formalization. And we're here to discuss the reasons for that trend and some of its implications and hear from some practitioners about what it means for them. So I'll leave it at that and let the panel introduce themselves briefly and talk a little bit about what they do. So Frank, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So Frank Patel. I'm the Chief Programs Officer at Cadastres Foundation. My background's really in land information, registry and cadastral systems. And the first part of my career was very much focused on top-down, government-led approaches with mixed results, with mixed success. With Cadastre, we kind of flip that on its head and take a bottom-up approach to documenting land rights that sometimes links with the formal system, but sometimes not. And we'll talk more about it today, I think.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Ann Hale Milleracey. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Radiant Earth Foundation. My background is as a geographer, and specifically in satellite remote sensing and geographic information systems. I have worked with a lot of technologies from radar systems to LiDAR systems to GPS systems and IMUs and satellites and a little bit with drones. And now our vision at the Radiant Earth Foundation is to aggregate the world's open imagery into one cloud-based platform and to associate that imagery with tools, analysis tools, to allow individuals to come in and create their own project. We're primarily focused on the global development community and in the global south. But with that said, we're also seeing a lot of interest in the platform from small startups in the global south, and we certainly want to encourage that.
Yeah, my name is Walter Volkman. I founded a little company called Micro Aerial Projects about 10 years ago. And my current focus is on using drone technology for the purpose of formalizing land rights. But prior to that, being a professional land surveyor in Namibia, I was a very early adopter of GPS technology. In fact, when it first came out, it was a single frequency solution only, highly inefficient for high productivity purposes, but very good for geodetic purposes, long distances and few points. And the dual frequency scenario only arose in the mid-90s, end 90s, when all of a sudden there was a huge breakthrough in productivity in dual frequency GNSS. This productivity led to a revolution in mapping. The big deal was beforehand you could never measure a distance unless it was visible from point to point. And GPS brought this beautiful function of not having to have that intervisibility, the visual line of sight, in order to make precise measurements on the ground. And so in my early years, I already had confrontations with the status quo, the officials and so on, in adopting satellite navigation and satellite surveying systems for precise measurement purposes. And I'm encountering very similar resistance and barriers now in the drone business. So, as far as GNSS is concerned, for surveying, the big difference between it and what Anne and I are doing at different altitudes is that GNSS, as efficiently as it may survey today, does one point at a time, whereas in Earth observation operations, we have arrays of sensors that we use instantaneously and at the same time. So GNSS is the background, basically, for all outdoor surveying, whether they be with mass sensors like LiDAR and image sensors, or other hybrid systems like hydrographic surveying. Anyway, that's sort of my take, my confrontation with GNSS in today's world.
And could we, I think maybe for the benefit of the audience, we should back up a little bit. Maybe we could say very briefly why using two frequencies is important and why it's significant that this is now becoming a possibility in your smartphone.
Shall I go?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so the second frequency allows us to do one of two things, one or the other. The first one is it allows us to eliminate the effects of the ionosphere on the satellite signals. As I said, now satellite signals travel over 220,000 kilometers. They traverse through a medium that is highly disruptive to propagation of electromagnetic signals. So having two frequencies allows us to determine the effect that the ionosphere has on the satellite signals and allows us to eliminate that effect. and therefore gives us the ability to measure distances of 5, 6, 7,000 kilometers to millimeter accuracy. That sort of thing is not possible unless you have a dual frequency technology in place. And when we talk about dual frequency, we talk about two different electromagnetic signals being sent down by the navigation satellites to the Earth. And they both transmit lots and lots of data that is superimposed on carrier phases. So there's a carrier wave that has got an extremely stable frequency on it. And so therefore the wavelength stays very stable. And there are if you have two different frequencies, in other words, two different wavelengths, you have enough observables to solve for this effect that the ionosphere has on the signals. If you don't want to use GNSS for very long distances, where you have to eliminate the effects of the ionosphere, if you are using shorter distances, you may assume that the ionospheric effect across the length of the line that you are measuring is more or less constant. If it's a short distance, and by short distance we mean in the order of 10 kilometers or 6 miles for you, to maybe 20 kilometers maximum. After that, GNSS accuracy quickly degrades as a result of the effects of the ionosphere. But if you are measuring shorter distances, you can do so extremely efficiently by utilizing the second frequency to resolve what we call the ambiguity of integers, the integer ambiguity. And I'll get back to that point just now. So imagine you have a device that can measure the distance between yourself and the satellite with a ruler, and you can only measure the fraction of the last graduation. You cannot measure the units, the integer number of units that fit between you and the other object. So you can only measure the last phase. That's what we do in a GPS receiver, only measures the phase of the wave as it comes in. So the formula for the distance between satellite and receiver on the ground is n times the number of wavelengths plus the fraction of the wavelength. And that fraction of the wavelength is all we can measure. And we get information as to where the satellite is, and we have our rough position on the Earth's surface, but we do not know how many whole numbers of wavelengths there are between us and the satellite. And that to calculate that requires a lot of processing, and if you do it with single frequency, it takes a lot of time to solve for this integer number. To resolve the integer ambiguity it takes a long time if you only have one frequency. If you have two, you can have it in a whiff. And that's where the power of the second frequency comes from. So you can set up a so-called reference station and a rover, and within seconds you can measure positions relative to your reference station in the order of millimeter accuracy within seconds. And if you have a total interruption of satellite reception, you can recover from that interruption within seconds again. Whereas if you had a single frequency receiver only, you'd have to wait an unpredictably long time to reestablish that integer ambiguity. The important thing to remember here is that when you're working with long-range GNSS, you use the second frequency only to resolve the integer ambiguity. You do not necessarily improve the efficiency. However, when you use short range, when you are using it for short-range purposes, you can instantaneously and on the fly have centimeter or millimeter accuracy.
So I'm going to try to summarize and abstract a little bit, because I think our definitions of high level are a little bit different. I don't have. So essentially, it allows you to be much more accurate in your measurements. It's more practical in the field in a number of respects because you can resolve these ambiguities much more quickly. And the reason that we haven't had access to this until very recently, except in professional kind of surveying settings with very costly equipment, is sort of twofold. One of them is that we haven't had enough satellites up in orbit broadcasting on two frequencies in a way that was accessible and totally open signal standards. And the other is that we've had, there are processing power requirements, a number of other hardware requirements. I think the consumer electronics revolution has helped bring us to this point in making processing power cheaper and in things like smartphones and putting it in the consumer's pocket. But there's also been a lot of increased interest in high accuracy positioning services for things like autonomous vehicles or for augmented reality. But we find ourselves at the cusp. I think within the next 5 years, they're going to be like the GPS constellation with the new satellites broadcasting a second open frequency will be completed. Europe's Galileo constellation is also scheduled to be completed within that time. And the end result being that you can buy a phone today where in a couple of years anywhere on Earth you'll be able to get full coverage from multiple frequencies. And in terms of your access to accurate positioning or even mapping applications, we're talking in an order of magnitude here, going from errors of meters, maybe the size of a room, to with some supplemental processing techniques getting down to the order of centimeters, and then you're talking about really powerful applications for mapping. And I think there's some other things that could be mentioned here. I know that you're a big advocate of the open source software used for processing, which is a very important development. I would also add that since 2016, Google's Android operating system, which is used in approximately, I think, 88% of all handsets in the world, gives developers access to the raw signal data from the satellites, which is needed for doing a lot of the signal processing that gets you down to centimeter accuracy. So I want to leave that for now and turn to you, Anne, and if you could talk a little bit about another aspect of the satellite industry, the one in which you work, Earth observation. Is there a parallel trend of increasing access to high-quality data?
Sure. There's a big parallel trend. In what is happening in the satellite market now, in the Earth observation section of the satellite market, is an initiative that's begrudgingly in some quarters referred to as new space. The people generally in old space don't like the new space moniker, but it's very disruptive. And it started here in the US, although I've seen it really take hold globally, which is really encouraging. And that is to disrupt the way satellites are built and designed. And that's all made possible by the same commercial off-the-shelf parts, by dual-frequency GPS, essentially by your cell phone and the cameras that were generated in your cell phone. So the pristine, magnificent, multi-billion-dollar instruments flown by the National Reconnaissance Office are about half the size of this room. They take more than a decade to build. They take more than $500 million to launch. Right now, they are very pristine. But what we're seeing now is the Earth is being imaged every single day by one company. And that company is called Planet. It used to be called Planet Labs. And their satellites are about this big. They're a CubeSat. They're a 3U CubeSat. They cost roughly, it's a company closely held information, but my guess is they cost, now that they've made that many of them, maybe $80,000 to build. They're so cheap to build, they don't even insure them. They don't have any fuel on board, so they're going to stay in orbit for about 18 months. They're going to burn up on re-entry. And they're, you could look every day and the number will change. There are roughly 137 to 145 of them on orbit today. And operating as a constellation, they image the Earth every day. That's one company. And they have wickedly disrupted the space from the two major incumbents. One is Digital Globe, which is a US company, and of course Airbus, which is a European company. They still have big, pristine, beautiful satellites, much more expensive, all available commercially. But there are about 15 other startup companies globally. Most of them are based out of the US, but there are some in India and Israel and out of Germany and others that are looking at electro-optical. We're seeing the same thing with SAR data, synthetic aperture radar data, startups in that space. It's all made possible by the commercialization of the technology that's going into your cell phone. It's made in mass, so it's bringing those parts down, the cost of those parts.
And it's interesting to see, I mean, maybe you can comment a bit on this, Frank, this convergence of all these technologies, there's sort of an interplay between, you having satellites launched with cell phone camera-based sensors on them, but also the cell phone itself is becoming the instrument for, using a lot of this data for mapping purposes. So as someone who, you guys build applications, right, for community mapping, what sort of doors does that open up for you?
No, I mean, just looking at the change in the last 10 years, it used to be that the data collection involved a ruler, a dystometer, a sheet of paper questionnaires, a GPS, and a camera, and probably a phone to coordinate with people. Now all of that's wrapped in a single device. In the early days of Cadastre, we really looked at what are the other ways people are going to be collecting and using data. But what we've seen is, there is a fear that mobile technology is still too expensive. Even in places where it is, 2 times the average GDP, we're finding that those partners are using a smartphone because it's the total data collection device. They don't have to worry about later transcribing from paper or compiling all this information. It's all synced instantly. So it's really opened the door to mobile applications that we can use in the field.
And how does that fit in with your spectrum of other tools? Like, because you're always going to have to be on the ground because you're collecting attribute data. Who lives where? Who are these people? You're trying to identify them. What about, so on the one hand, GPS data is lovely for mapping, but as Walter alluded to, you're only collecting single points. If you were to fly a drone overhead, you could see a lot more than that. If you're taking Earth observation, you see a lot more than that. So how do you combine those tools?
No, that's a great point. And it's one of our first conversations with partners is really about how accurate does the data need to be, because that's going to drive a lot of the technology decisions. In particular, when we look at dense urban areas, there's a realization that the accuracy inherent in your smartphone GPS, even with an external antenna, is probably not going to be good enough. But we've worked with some partners who are using the drone imagery. So that instead of collecting the GPS points in the field, they're going out, filling out the questionnaire on a tablet or smartphone, and then showing that tablet and the imagery to the land occupant and saying, pick out your corner points, and then verifying those with all of the neighbors. So you can kind of instantly contextualize the data. And I would add, there's probably a little bit more of an inherent trust in that person whose data is being collected. When they're seeing someone out with a GPS, XY coordinates aren't going to mean much to them. But when they're looking at a picture of their property that they can instantly contextualize, they're more confident that the data being recorded reflects the reality as they understand it.
This is an interesting question. I think I've heard this. It's actually rather contentious, surprisingly contentious, I think, to most people outside of the land administration community. The issue of accuracy, when is it necessary, and to what degree? There are people who will say that it's, you should relax standards instead of mapping things as accurately as possible. I think primarily because it's too expensive often, and engineering survey grade accuracy might not be helpful in terms of, is there a limit to how,
So as a blue-blooded land surveyor, a cadastral surveyor who should protect his turf, I think the equipment acquisition costs are only part of the story. Obviously, it is more expensive to buy inadequate technology en masse than it is to buy adequate technology and focus on that. So a land administration organization that purchases 20 single-frequency GPS receivers so that they can send 20 crews out at once is not going to do as well, I would argue, as an organization that only sends out one dual-frequency receiver. So this question of accuracy and cost has a lot to do with how efficient you are in the field. And there's also the consideration of how well can you integrate the spatial measurement with the other data collection processes. And to what degree can you integrate efficiently and line this all up into a smooth workflow? But the biggest, if I neglected to say just now, the biggest issue, and this is hooks up with the accuracy question, the biggest issue, the biggest contributor of dual frequency GNSS is the rapid establishment, not only of accuracy that comes to you free of charge, more than that, and you know nowadays that the second frequency will be so much cheaper, but maybe much more importantly than the accuracy itself is a very, very reliable quality indicator. That if you have the ambiguities resolved, in other words, the integer number of wavelengths between you and the satellite, if you have them resolved, your position is said to be accurate to 1 centimeter plus 1 part per million of the distance between your reference receiver and your rover. And that quality stamp comes to you also free of charge. So accuracy is one thing in land rights, but reliability is as important a thing, to my mind. And so dual frequency GNSS throws both of those at you, and now at a much reduced cost. So that's where I see the significance of it. And the other thing that one must bear in mind is that to date you were relying on mainly government-funded or large corporation-funded correction services, so so-called augmentation services, which, similar costing to your satellite builds, were significant, and you couldn't afford as a private enterprise to establish these augmentation services. Today, you can do that quite easily. You can scatter some of these this size. Every 40 kilometers, have a network of these every 40 kilometers in your area of operation, and you can provide your own augmentation service. And the beauty is that what the global positioning system, the American system, brought to us was for the first time a global coordinate system. So all of this is not dependent anymore for approval of some government institution or somebody with high credentials. If you use the technology correctly, you can very easily, very transparently demonstrate that you are on the international terrestrial framework. So you're not dependent on Big Brother anymore in your own little operations. And accuracy is really democratized. It's affordable and accessible at the local level.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think not underestimating the cultural, bureaucratic issues is important. We saw it here in the U.S. I used to represent the federal government on a number of data committees, and this issue of authoritative data is a loaded political bomb, if you will. It becomes, no, I'm in charge of that, you have to work to my standards,
Yeah.
or my services, which cost, or, and in the case of surveyors, and I can say this having been a registered surveyor at one point, protecting that employment opportunity. And we're seeing this technology break through many of those political and bureaucratic barriers that really can stymie progress.
The accuracy is becoming moot in this point. So for example, you could have some of these scattered around in your area, and then you could actually rent them, for example, put it down on a property corner, it's all switched on. You don't have to interfere with this at all. It's not connected. It's not connected to the internet at all. It just records raw observations from the satellite. And this could be a property corner, and you could have all the parties that have interest in this property corner gathering around this feature, and you take a cell phone, and you take a picture of the adjudication party together with this symbol of the property corner, take a picture of that. And that is the field survey done. The survey aspect, the spatial data collection part done. Done with. Better than any handwritten field book, better than any filled-in form, never mind how clever you do it. It's and it's not an old concept. Frank and I did this 10 years ago in Ghana. We established a multimedia cadastre. And so even though our approaches become a little bit more sophisticated, the result of it is a real simplification of the field operation. So it all happens through timing. So since our cell phones are now GPS geared, even though their position might not be very good because of the antenna issues, their timing is GPS time. So you use the time as the link to all the different aspects of the data that you are collecting. So it's better than any hardware link, and you might argue with me. But timing, having synchronized clocks is all you need as far as hardwiring equipment is concerned.
I mean, it seems that what you're getting at, though, is there's a difference between the accuracy of the data provided and I don't know, the integrity. Or the government can choose not to trust or to accept data, mapping data that's very accurate.
The very observations which produce the accuracy and the reliability factor are stored and verifiable by whoever wants to inspect them. And it's completely transparent. It's checkable. Anybody who wants to go to the trouble of challenging the data can do so. It's recorded forever.
And would it be possible to fake that data?
It's extremely difficult. We have over 100 satellites now that we could choose from. You cannot resolve the ambiguities unless you have data of integrity. So if the ambiguities are resolved once, you use the same kind of observations, they will be resolved the second time in the second run. So there's very little chance of corrupting the data. And you know what's also interesting, Anne? Is, we focus on accuracy all the time. And, that's really, spatial data is there to back up a boundary's location in case the physical manifestation of the boundary has disappeared. That's all we need it for. Okay, the taxman wants to know how big the parcel is and so on. But from the owner's perspective, he has a land survey done to guarantee that his borders or his boundaries will not be corrupted in case they are either maliciously or nefariously moved, or there's some other natural cause for it. And for that we use mathematics and expensive land surveyors. I sometimes think, just a picture showing the contextual, showing the boundary location in its spatial context is enough, is irrefutable in a court case much more easily than mathematics and deeply buried skills would do. So take a picture from the air and say this boundary ran midway between these two buildings. The two buildings are of a much more permanent nature than a little monument that the land surveyor places there, for example. So the emphasis on single point accuracy is to be seen in the context of what is happening now with the abundance of the overflow, information overflow that comes to us via imagery. And I can see drones losing their role soon if Anne and them keep at it. I mean, we are now, what are you talking about, 10 centimeter resolution?
30.
Okay, so we still have
You've got
10
the
years
edge.
or so?
You've got the edge.
10 years.
Yeah.
I mean, is there a realistic prospect of that resolution increasing? My understanding is it's technically possible to have higher resolution satellite imagery, but it's prevented by regulation.
It's not politically possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's not politically possible. The U.S. government certainly controls the spatial resolution of any instrument flown by a U.S. organization. And they recently relaxed it 2-3 years ago to 30 centimeters, which is great data. Yeah, which is great data. We can see most of what we need to see from space with 30 centimeters.
Yes, and and we've only been doing that now since the 80s, early 80s. Landsat, 80 by 80 meter pixels. Now we are at 80. Yeah. So. The other interesting thing about this new period that we are going through is that for the first time, we have a mapping medium, raster mapping, that is continuous. There are no voids. There's nothing left to the imagination or the we don't have to rely on the interpretation of one human being walking around at 1.8 meters. He has got the 1.8 meter above ground level perspective, and that's it. We have perspective from all directions now. We can do virtual surveying. So we can produce maps for Frank's kind of client base. We can produce maps where you don't have to go to the field anymore. As long as you can see what you can see from the top, you can virtually demarcate properties. So this whole idea of producing line maps that don't communicate to all levels of society and all pockets of society is over now, because we have pictures and maps that speak more than 1,000 words.
I mean, I think it's a fascinating prospect. So you can imagine something in the future where you have a very high resolution sort of Google Maps, and it can suggest demarcations of properties. But then the question becomes, okay, so how do you connect people to those properties, and how do you validate that they were demarcated correctly? It strikes me that there's kind of a risk there of creating a digital divide, where there are going to be people who, can step up and say, yes, that's mine. They have internet access. They can go scroll through this thing in their web browser, and other people who are totally unaware that it exists. And so I'm wondering how the organizational challenges sort of differ if you move away from the traditional kind of on-the-ground point surveying.
I think more and more you're seeing a movement towards, is the possibility for automatic feature detection. The case studies I've seen is that the error rate still seems to be pretty high, and the variation between contexts. The features in Mozambique versus the features in Haiti are going to be very different, and you're going to need a whole different training data set. So I'm not sure it's there yet, because there's such a need for verification in the field and the potential for it to lead to conflict. We looked at one project where it seemed very obvious, the features, but it was every field. Well, you factor in that most farmers are planting multiple crops. So their one plot looks like 10 plots, because each crop looked like its own polygon in the automatic feature detection. But I think there's certainly a lot more work to be done there.
But there's a prospect there of sort of bifurcating the actual mapping activity completely from the community surveying.
From the field work.
Is that accurate?
Potentially, and I would say there's tremendous risk there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little more about that?
Sure. I mean, that community approach really ties into that idea of democratizing the information. And a big part of that, of course, is higher accuracy data on the GPS side, but also more powerful technology via smartphones, et cetera. But the community process is often the most important part, and can be the most challenging. If they're not well informed, if they don't understand the process, if they're not engaged, you can quickly run into an issue where you have technicians collecting data that aren't from the community, that might not understand the nuances, that are seen as outsiders, and come in for a couple of days and leave, which inevitably leaves a lot of distrust in that process.
And there's another issue here which always, rears its head, which is that you can have the greatest technical solution, but it can still be difficult to replicate in different environments, because the social environments are so different. So I'm wondering, is there a limit to the efficiency, even with these great new methods of measuring things? This can be based on you having to go there with your team, learn the local environment, organize it in a way that's very sensitive. If they have a problem with, a disparity in land ownership between men and women, for example, you have to make sure that the people adjudicating take that into account, and you're not codifying existing inequalities. I mean, is all of that effort just going to be a baseline forever in this work?
In some ways, yes, and I think I can even point to some of our early learnings at Cadastre when we were building technology that was meant to be as simple as possible for collecting and managing property rights data. But the reality is, with many of our partners, they'd be asking just those questions of how do we address the gender issue? How do we resolve land conflicts? How do we align our data collection with the national standards? What accuracy should we be looking at? So inevitably, there was a requirement for a pretty heavy touch. And while it varies between partners, for many of them, particularly that don't have a background or in-house land expertise, that means we spend weeks in the field with them, helping to define some of those things before we're out collecting data in the field.
And so do you track over time, sort of like time per parcel mapped or any other kind of metrics?
We do, but the variation ends up being so extreme because of a number of factors. You know, how much evidence is being collected in forms of testimonies or neighbor affidavits? How large a questionnaire are you doing? What's the accuracy requirement? So we have some partners that can do a parcel in 10, 15 minutes, others where it's a 4-hour process.
But in general, I mean, what's the time breakdown, right? In terms of how much time is spent on the mapping of land as opposed to gathering all this other information?
The upfront work, kind of the social side, the public education, the gaining the community buy-in can often take as long, if not longer, depending on the scale.
But I would ask, Frank, I would imagine the benefits of that community engagement stay with that community not only in acquiring their land rights, but in their ability to deal with other governance issues. And bringing that community together, educating them, and having them work collaboratively with each other sets a precedent for other civil society activities.
Without a doubt. And we have one of our partners, Namati, really focuses on that governance side. And they'll often go and put in and help the community to develop a code, elect leaders, and really have a representative process. And the result of that has been a real community engagement and a vested tie and building in that governance capacity.
Yeah.
They have a great story that I will borrow from them to share of working in Liberia, where the community leaders had allocated a large piece of land to a timber company and thought they were getting a fair price. And they went back a year or so later and said, well, what's the benefit you had from that timberland? You got X amount of firewood, you got Y amount of meat from it, you were able to harvest tree nuts. So over 10 years, that's an asset value of 10x, shall we say. Well, they'd sold that or leased that out for 1x. It was a short-term gain, but now they have to replace all the goods they received from it.
Right.
And that actually showed the poor governance and having all of the power in the hands of the chieftains, the chief and elders, as opposed to really a community leadership.
Which really, I mean, introduces there is a vast amount of information that is really pertinent to land use and security of tenure that's far beyond simply mapping coordinates. I'm sure that, Anne, you might be able to talk a little bit about, how Earth observation can be used to estimate some of these other qualities, agricultural production or...
Yeah, I think just to stay with the GPS signal or GNSS signal, I've worked with a company, I used to run a company that is looking at GPS radio occultation. So having small sats on orbit that measure how the signal moves through the ionosphere and then grazes the Earth's atmosphere. If you can build a receiver that's tracking those signals, whether it's any 4 of the constellations, is actually a weather satellite. And it's the most accurate measurement of temperature and pressure that exists, because it's just the math that Walter alluded to. The bending angle, how that signal is bending through the Earth's atmosphere, is the most accurate measure of temperature and pressure, and it also can map the ionosphere and warn of solar flares. That's one fascinating application. And there are 3 companies, commercial companies, on orbit now with radio occultation sensors. The Internet of Things, and what we're going to see with the Internet of Things. There's another company that I've done some work with called Saildrone that we all know about autonomous vehicles, but what about autonomous vessels, right? So vessels at sea, you can go to their website. They have about, I think, 35 vessels at sea right now. They're manufacturing 2 a week. And these vessels can go out for 12 months at a time. And they're all controlled from an iPhone. They can all be controlled from an iPhone. They use wave power and solar power. They use GPS and IMU, and they have over 100 instruments off these vessels. They look at the land-water interface for meteorological observations. They look down at fisheries, and they now are running artificial intelligence on the fish they see to determine the fish species. They can look up and look at the radiance of the sun. And you can't buy one, but you can operate one for $2,000 a day. That is so cheap.
Cool.
That is really, really cheap. To put a vessel at sea with human lives, sometimes transiting for weeks before they get to the spot that they're going to sample, right? Or putting people in harm's way in the Arctic or the Antarctic. So that's revolutionizing the way that we measure the ocean fishery stocks, its bathymetry, its chlorophyll, its contribution to our weather. So we're going to see the integration of all these sensors, and my guess is within about 7 to 10 years we will have a digital twin of the Earth, with the Internet of Things, with sailing vessels, with autonomous vessels, with multiple imaging companies imaging every day. I think we will see that. I think part of the trick is going to be put that to work for good and be concerned about the unintended consequences.
Yeah, and I think that's it's a really interesting future. It's an almost total paradigm shift. I think at FPR we see this largely through the light of our recent work we've done on digital identity. Because if you live in a world where you have this profusion of sensors creating all of this data all the time, it's the challenge of mapping is no longer, go out, generate the data. It's really, I think, if you're the government and you want to accept registration of a parcel, how do you know who it came from? And I think like an analogy that a panelist in one of our previous panels made is very apt here. It's something like TurboTax, where you sit back, you receive the form, you receive the document, and then you can certify it, and you can audit it if something is sort of fraudulent. But it's sort of like what Walter was describing there, where if someone can submit a photograph of an agreement, or they can digitally sign saying we are neighbors and we've mutually agreed upon this border, the data was already there.
How can that be impeachable? I mean, it's very tough to cook those books. The interesting extension of what you said just now, having a duplicate of the world is what's emerging now is that, in most geospatial or geographic information systems, we use attributes for unique identification. So every parcel has to have a unique number. An owner has to have a unique number. So you can't do all the analyses without having non-spatial attributes to define things uniquely. Well, an interesting thing that comes about now because of the precision with which we can measure things and which we can place things, especially in the context of the Internet of Things, is that one of your most unique attributes of any object of interest is what? It's very logical, it's very simple, is its location. Because you can't have two things occupying the same space at the same time. So once that gets exploited and merged with the conventional way of making sure that you identify objects in the Internet of Things or so uniquely and correctly, would be the tracking of its position. It's just another byproduct of this fascinating level of accuracy and reliability we get out of our positioning tools of today.
Thank you for that, Walter. Do we have any more comments from the panel? Anything else you want to talk about?
No, not other than that, I see huge opportunities for the democratization of all things around mapping and planning, especially planning. We're talking about land rights, but land rights in a governance vacuum don't mean much. Land rights, if I have a little abstract square drawn on a piece of paper in pink telling me that this is mine, if I don't understand the environment around it, spatially as well as politically, it doesn't really mean much to me. I really don't know where I am, and other people don't know where I am, so the interest, the tradability of my asset is zero. So the governance issues are important, and so we shouldn't just be galloping behind technology. The adjudication factor of what we measure so precisely is critical. And so I don't think that the spatial collection aspect in the land rights effort is going to be the bottleneck. I think it's going to be the other way around. It's getting the adjudication firmly established so that it survives. Yeah.
But the fact that you can even say that is, I think, a sign of remarkable progress in this endeavor. We can go from my favorite infographic, 1,000 years to survey Uganda without, all the informal parcels, without any transfers happening during that period, to the mapping is probably not the bottleneck.
A cadastre that is not accepted by the community is extremely expensive because you've got to run to the courts all the time.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I mean, the British had a thing called beating the bounds. Have you heard of the beating of the bounds? They took to make sure that the whole community remembered exactly or had some kind of institutional memory about where a boundary was. They took a boy at the impressionable age of 12 or so, 2 boundary corners, and gave him a beating everywhere, wherever there was a boundary, so he would never forget for the rest of his life where these boundaries were. And it's, if you don't involve community, the real value of a cadastre or a property system is that mutual respect within the community for these boundaries and of these boundaries.
It's a social fabric.
It's a social fabric more than the geometric one that counts in the context of land rights.
And mercifully, we do now have better ways of retaining that sort of information.
Beating the bounds.
Yeah. So I think with that, we'll take it to audience questions. And Tim is going to run the microphone. If you have a question, please do identify yourself and speak into the mic.
Amy Kokenauer.
It should be on.
Okay. Amy Kokenauer from Cadastre Foundation. Thanks to all of you. It's a great panel. One of the things that we've noticed in our work is in our interaction with government, this idea of sovereignty of data, protection of data, that this is our data, we don't want an outside group holding it, storing it, managing it, collecting it, things like that. And even though we do community-based processes so that they're collecting their own data, what I was wondering from each of you is, what are some of your strategies, some of your thinking around the issue of national sovereignty, the issue of data use, and sort of getting national governments to accept alternative technologies and methodologies as part of their data and technology transformation, so to speak?
Well, I'll jump in. It wasn't too long ago that here in the U.S. we saw a lot of those same issues, right? 15 years ago. I used to run an airborne mapping company, and we had the contract to fly DC, and which was not an easy thing to do, not because the geography is particularly difficult, but because of the politics, right? And you can't fly an aircraft, and this was before 9/11, can't fly an aircraft in DC without a Secret Service agent on board. And when you'd land the aircraft, the film or digital would be extracted, and the FBI and the Secret Service, and all of a sudden, that big white building over here to our left no longer existed on the film, right? So we never delivered a product with the White House on it. All right, so now go to Google Maps. All right, that image was collected 6 months ago. All right, they have a requirement every 6 months they can refresh their data. So we are certainly not immune from that. What I have seen, and I grew up in state government and then went to federal government and then worked with organizations around the world, specifically around data, is that it's a political issue. And to the extent that you can get them to buy in and to be a part of the project and to benefit and find that executive leadership and navigate the politics, but it just takes time. And obviously getting those leaders who are responsible for that geography to buy in is everything, but sometimes you just don't find it happening. I mean, I've done a good bit of work in India, which is very technically, India is very good, but you will find that it's a jobs program because they have so many people to put to work. And so instead of using the latest technology, they're going to still do it the same way. And oh, by the way, they're still going to use carbon paper. I was there like 6 months ago, and there was carbon paper to get me into a federal government building. So it's a mixture between jobs and control and political buy-in. That's much more difficult than the technology, much more difficult. But when you do it right and it takes root and it becomes the denominator, it's very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, with a little bit of experience that we have in getting drone technology accepted and tolerated, disruptive as it is, I think it is always wise to play the game with the authorities in such a way that you make them feel like they are the innovators. On the one hand, demonstrate that this is a train that nobody can stop, and on the other hand, collaborate. Be sympathetic and positive, and also have a certain level of sympathy for their situation, because it is as disruptive to them as it is to the organized professions in the private sector. You know, in Ghana, if you're a civil servant in Ghana, good luck trying to raise a family on your salary. So your means of income is selling coordinates or processing data that a private company is not allowed to process. They will process it for you for a small fee, and that's how they maintain their lives.
No, and certainly that question of data sovereignty and data ownership, I'd say particularly in the property rights space, the idea of open data is really lagging behind. And even countries with an open data policy, you'll often find that there's resistance to the registry and cadastre being open, oftentimes because the politicians who would approve it own probably more land than they legally should, and it would raise a lot of questions. You know, I'm not sure I share your optimism that spatial data collection won't be the bottleneck. Technically, it shouldn't be, but there are the barriers to entry in the existing land professionals.
I would say the generation of new data is not the bottleneck.
Yeah.
Retrieving legacy data and having to live with that, that's the problem.
Yeah. Now getting the verification
you can generate it.
And government approval
Yeah.
is the challenge.
Because, you know, the nice thing that GPS brought to the world is, again, as I said, this global reference system. So it is, the citizen can now place himself to centimeter accuracy anywhere on the globe. And he can do so transparently and doesn't have to prove a major case or have a PhD to prove the case. It's very evident. So that is real power. You know, in the Russians used to introduce false coordinate origins in their mapping. You must have known that. If you wanted to do anything in the East, the top state secret was what was the coordinate, the falsification factor in the coordinate system. You know, that was a state secret. Just the spatial information was so important to them in those years. So that's totally passé now. There's no government that can control that anymore.
It's funny though. I was on a phone conversation just this morning, and from a stranger who called me who does work for the intelligence community here in the U.S. and on satellite imaging, and he asked me this question about being concerned about the falsifying of imagery. So I've been in this business for 33 years, and and I never got that question until about 14 months ago. And I bet I have gotten that question 30 times in the last 14 months. The cadence of people worried about, just like the Russians did with their coordinate system, going in and changing the data to make the data look different from reality. Clearly, there's some concern around that risk, and usually that risk is, if that many people start asking that question, it's informed by an event, would be my guess. I think the other interesting technology that we haven't mentioned that is just last week was disrupted in a big way is the satellite downlinks around the globe. So for most of these satellites to download their data, they have to wait to pass over a ground station. And those ground stations are generally pretty expensive. And depending on the size of the data that's coming down, it's usually about 4, 5, 6 hours. And the downloads, and then it gets shipped to whoever from the ground station to the satellite operator's facility, and it gets processed, and then it can be pushed out. In the case of satellite imagery, unless you are a very big client, the best you can do with that, with commercial data, is 4 or 5 hours. Amazon Web Services announced last week in San Francisco that they are now in the ground station business. And they are building ground stations all around the globe right next to their cloud computing centers. And they will be able to push this data out in near real time. And that's a great business model for them, because they've already got to have that infrastructure. All they're doing is adding a few antennas. And they're going to dramatically speed up the time in which we can get our hands on this data that's rolling down from space, because everybody's got to come down through a downlink or a fiber-to-fiber link. So I think that's also going to change our world in the next 3 or 4 years.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
Jill Pike, Millennium Challenge Corporation. Thanks to all of you. This has been a really interesting discussion. My question is for Ann and Walter. And Walter, you actually started to answer it already, but I'm still going to go ahead and ask, maybe to push you a little farther. In the space of project efforts to map boundaries, donors, experts, we're all easily compelled and convinced by the importance of the newest and best technology. There's this parallel space which you started to speak to, which is cadastral agencies in many of the countries in which we work. And since both of you are very future thinking in your thinking, I'm wondering, what are the factors and drivers in the next 10 years that are going to start to change the mindset of national cadastral agencies with respect to new technology? What are the factors that are going to make them realize that upgrading is something that's worth doing compared to what they're working with today?
Yeah, thanks. I see a big spasm, developing. I think in the established world, in the world where the concept of a cadaster is second nature, they will adapt and develop. Those who do not jump on now will be usurped. Cadastre is doing that right now already. So I think that's where it's going to go. Those who, and the what is it called? The commercial value of owning data or controlling data in your role as a civil servant, that commodity will diminish over time. And I think it's a question of you get on it or you be usurped, one of the two.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think there's a huge generational gap. So, the surveyor, the national surveyors, of the countries around the globe, they have generally been in pretty prominent positions, right? And they're generally older and maybe not as familiar with many of these techniques. Same with the statistician's office, right? And how closely held statistics are at the national level. And the conversations at the UN now, there's a group called the UNGGIM, the Global Information Management System, and inviting in those national surveyors that represent their countries and the statistics agencies. That's a very different crowd than the crowd that's 22 years old and would be happy to use a Jupyter notebook and fly a drone and be terribly comfortable with it. So I think generational is a big part of the solution.
Yeah, and generally the decentralization in data collection and information generation is going to make it extremely difficult to keep a monopoly on the data or the information.
No, I think the fact that the data is needed. If the government's not able to deliver it, somebody else will, because companies want it, supply chains need it, service companies.
Banks will most probably be the first to just get frustrated. They can't do business unless there's a security of tenure. And if the government fails, it's just like with education In Ghana, there's, a large proportion of the kids go to private school. And so you will have private, you could think of a private cadastre, yeah, sorry.
Hi, my name's Ben Brockman. I'm at ID Insight. We're an impact evaluation research organization that works in Asia and Africa. And we do a lot of household surveying and often use Android applications for surveying. And we'd love to match up our survey data with Anne's fleet of satellite imagery. But right now, there's a 5 to 25 meter accuracy issue on a lot of our household surveying, which really limits the ability to link those two data sources. So very excited to hear about the Chinese phone that was mentioned earlier to really increase that accuracy, but I'm wondering when the price point will come down or that will become ubiquitous in low-cost smartphones that are in the $100, $150 range, as opposed to the $400 or $500 range. Because our fleet of surveyors will be able to collect an amazing amount of information when that happens, but I'm just wondering if you have any insight on the timeline of that technological incorporation into other smartphones.
Well, I mean, it's actually fascinating. I was thinking about bringing this up, and then I thought it was a tangent. There's a good bit of work being done now in sub-Saharan Africa using Earth observation, very high resolution commercial imagery, and machine learning to identify every building structure in sub-Saharan Africa. And the reason is that it's not so much about the building as it is the size of the building and whether that's a home to drive to population data. It's being done for the malaria programs, polio programs, primarily funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Back to Walter's point about a commercial cadastre, because it's needed, Frank's point, that data has already all been generated, and it's being sold by Digital Globe to companies like Here. So how many people in the room have heard of Here? Here's really probably one of the most progressive mapping companies you've never heard of, because they are feeding data into Apple Maps, into Google Maps, into your navigation systems of the future. And so back to your point, though, so Digital Globe has licensed that data to Here, but now they're also licensing that data to the global development community. And it's a big number. It's a big number to get your hand on that data. So the issue is it exists. Much of this data exists, but it's the business structure and the license structure of how to get your hands on it. So you're a commercial entity, you couldn't use it. But if you were a nonprofit, you could. So it's kind of messy.
Yeah. And speaking to the cost of the phones, I mean, the Xiaomi it's sort of the flagship phone of that line, but you're still talking about a $400 Android phone. This is not the iPhone XS. And my understanding is that the actual cost of adding that hardware contributes virtually nothing to the price of the phone. And if you think about the reduction we've seen in the price of GPS capabilities in mobile devices, I think the first phone that had the GPS capability was iPhone 3 maybe, in circa, I don't know, was it 2007, 2009, I forget. But it's been, roughly a decade, and already the cost is negligible of the hardware itself. I would expect this to become standard in every smartphone. I don't see why not. And this chip actually cuts in half the power consumption. As we know, GPS is kind of a battery hog. So there are a lot of, and there are OEM manufacturers that are competing to produce these things en masse, not just for phones, but for a lot of other applications, other wearables, smart watches, even autonomous vehicles. So, even just this lets you go. The Xiaomi, I mean, it was tested by the European Space Agency. You're looking at sub-meter out of the box. You can improve that pretty considerably. They tested some signal processing stuff and got it down to the centimeter level using like RTK and precise point positioning. So, just going from 5 meters, like you know what road you're on, to lane level, turn-by-turn navigation, I think that's a big feature for phones to compete on. So I would expect everyone to adopt it. And so if you give it a couple generations, or 5, 10 years, even very entry-level Android phones.
Hi, I'm John Cloud, and I was a historian of the Coast Survey, which turned into NOAA. I worked at NOAA. And I'd like to ask you all to kind of flip things on this coin around on the other side, because everything here that's been talked about really comes down to the accuracy and precision of defining parcels. And I'd like to talk about that just briefly in the context of what became a major environmental lesson in American history, what turned into American history, the Great Mahele in the Hawaiian Islands. The classic Hawaiian island is a truncated cone, and it has ridges with little concavities between them, and a single unit between two ridges on down to the ocean is a ahupuaha, which is an ecological unit. Everything from the freshwater rain on the top, going all the way down to the fish ponds at the bottom and the fringing coral reefs. And the ahupuahas were managed and organized as ecological units. And there's all kinds of things about how that was done that was horribly unfair. Feudal society, et cetera, et cetera. But when the Great Mahele happened, all of that turned into property. And particularly the bottom, there were watershed reserves preserved up above, but most of the land of Hawaii turned into kuleanas, which are parcels, which are everything you've been talking about. And you've been talking about progress as relatively greater accuracy in defining the corners, et cetera, of the parcels. But in the case of Hawaii, the parcels worked geometrically. They did not necessarily work ecologically. And there was major changes and great deterioration, all kinds of levels of this unique ecosystem of the Hawaiian Islands that was completely bound up with the parcelization of what had been the ahupuahas. So could you kind of turn the coin over you've been talking about a little bit and talk about some of the other, how does precise parcelization enhance or limit and truncate the kind of ecological integration that is absolutely paramount for successful continuation of life on Earth on every level?
There happens to be a process in Germany called Flurbereinigung, cleaning up of the parcel pattern to better serve the environmental reality. So there is a case in demonstrating that what you are talking about is being realized. So private property, individual property is a big deal, but I think a lot of the fields that we are involved with concern communal properties as well, indigenous rights. The respect for indigenous land tenure systems is written all over us here, I think. So to what degree we always consider ecological givens, I don't know, because we normally end up with de facto situations as it is, that we most probably then somewhat unknowingly reinforce against environmental interests. Could be. I don't know.
Yes. Back to the ecosystem services and the ecological unit. In fact, I worked for NOAA, but before I worked for NOAA, I worked for the state of South Carolina, and I was director of natural resources planning, and I had a grant from the National Geodetic Survey, and Gilbert, I can't remember Gilbert's last name, to build one of the first watershed geographic information systems in the country. The Edisto River, 3,120 square miles, longest Blackwater River in the U.S. And clearly, I mean, it's really been carved up now. That was a long time ago. But that was our thesis, was that we need to find the wetlands. We need to map the wetlands. We need to map the land use up against the wetlands. We need the cadastre for all of that area. We need to know where the archaeological sites are. We need to know where the endangered species sites are. We need to know where the best industrial locations are for the future, because this area is going to grow. It's at the intersection of I-26 and I-95. Let's be proactive, all right? So we spent north of, and back in that day, it was even more money than today, probably $8 million of NGS's money from a congressional add-on that came through Senator Hollings, to map that like no other ecosystem had been mapped in the U.S. to that point. And then we brought together the communities, and we created communities about economic development, about fisheries, about interbasin transfer of water and water rights, and ran this community process and let them work with the maps and come together. You know, when the federal money dried up and some of the state money dried up, the database still exists, but that community level effort kind of died down. About 2 years ago, the state Department of Health and Environmental Control gave an outside corporation a very big permit to extract a tremendous amount of water out of that river to run a potato farm. And in fact, that river now sometimes almost looks dry, and it was a beautiful, beautiful river. That's brought that community back together, and because they see the threat to not only their livelihood, but the landscape and the ecosystem services that it provided not only to man, but to endangered species and GAR and a whole host of other things. And so that community has now come back together and is starting it. But I mean, I think that speaks to the bigger issue of we as a culture don't really value our natural resources and those ecosystem services.
I'd add one of the challenges we really face in land administration is the disconnect we often find between government legal processes and how community and customary rights might be recognized. And it often forces those communities to look at it from a partial perspective. But that often overrides the multiple uses of the land, the overlapping rights, and how they're accessed. And it's something I think the land community writ large really works on to address.
Unfortunately, you know, the performance measure is always looming over you. You got limited resources. How many parcels did you survey last year, or last month, or last week? And in that zeal, I think often we forget planning. You know, never mind something as virtuous as the ecology or the natural environment. We sometimes just parcel out like crazy without thinking about issues like access, future expansions, increased mobility, increased disposable income resulting in other modes of transport. All of those things get sometimes brushed aside in our zeal to establish property, private property rights. So I think, especially when there are political forces behind something like this, it's very difficult to make sufficient provision for some long-term perspective before you parcel things out. And that's where the adjudication thing comes in. It's not just a matter of, creating new spatial networks. It's one to establish an inventory in multi-dimensions, and then to plan, and then to start thinking about how to put private parcels into that sort of environment. Because the reverse engineering of that is very, very expensive. Now, nothing is more controversial than, what is it called here? Eminent domain, or the English call it expropriation of land rights. It's very expensive.
I think we've got about 5 minutes left. Time for one more question? Or maybe two. See if we can squeeze them in, one and then the other. If you could ask both of your questions together, and then the panel can respond.
Okay. My name's Stafford Nichols. I work at the company Gallup, and of course we do a lot of surveys around the world. And we're doing a survey called Prindex, which Property Rights Index, and asking questions about not only what sort of documentation people have for their property rights, but also what their perceptions are in terms of how secure it is, and basically, yeah, their level of security that they feel like they have. And we're finding all over the world that people have a lot of insecurity, as I'm sure you all know. But one of the pushes, we're expanding the survey next year to cover 140 countries, and then the plan there after that is to push the United Nations to make it a sustainable development goal. So I was curious what your thoughts are on having it be this United Nations level policy agenda item, and maybe the reality of that as well. So that's my question, but I'll pass it.
My name's Terry Hill. I'm with the Emerge Alliance, okay? I'm interested in the return of direct current, and maybe at the level of a city block. And it has national security implications. It has a whole bunch of things. So you mentioned using the technology to create community, and then there's another mention about solar flares and something to be measuring that. So I assume that what your technology could facilitate planning that sort of fantasy. It's a fantasy at this point, but the idea of getting the utility grid down to the city block level. Thanks.
Utility grid.
UN?
I'll start with Prindex, I suppose.
Yeah.
No, I'm glad it was mentioned. Certainly, I would say broadly within the land sector, something we've suffered from is a lack of real hard data. There's a lot of anecdotal information about tenure security and how people feel and what the effect is. Raising it to the level to real concrete household level information, starting with 15 countries, is a fantastic baseline, and to hear it's expanding to go almost global is even better. For us at Cadastre, it's critical as we measure our own impact. Are people using our system feeling more tenure secure? Well, now we have something to compare it against. So really excited to see how it develops and if it does make it into kind of a global UN initiative.
So I've had a little bit of engagement with the UNGGIM and the UN Sustainable Goals, Development Goals activities, and you know, I'm just really pragmatic. And so I'm always a little skeptical about that level of orchestration and how it sifts down through all of these countries. But with that said, the level of activity at the UN level and with organizations across the globe that are really starting to dive deep on the Sustainable Development Goals and how data is used to inform that, it's sustained, you know, it's getting sustained. And so, you know, I think I need to get over my skepticism and get on the bandwagon because we all want to see that happen, right? We all want to see that happen. So I guess that would be my comment there.
I don't have much to add to that.
Okay.
That league is beyond me. I'm in the narrow gauge on the ground.
Back to the ionosphere. So we don't have, the global we, don't have a good feel for what's going on in the ionosphere. GPS radio occultation could be an early warning system, but at best you get a 15-minute warning from GPS radio occultation. I do believe that NASA and NOAA flew a satellite about 1.5 years ago. I'm not directly engaged in that business anymore. That's looking at deep space and looking at the ionosphere and solar flares. But I still think that's a big R, a big research. It's not close to a little d development yet. So the Earth is really exceptionally vulnerable from the ionosphere. We've just been really, really lucky. I think bringing the Internet of Things together, though, there's no doubt in my mind 5-10 years from now that every pole will be mapped and what's on that pole will have a direct internet connection and you will be able to communicate with it. So when you get a system sensor that can give warning of an ionospheric flare, it could be communicated and then maybe shut that block down. So I would imagine, I mean, it seems like not straightforward, it's an expensive problem, and it's a huge risk, but it seems like it's all doable.
Yeah, and as far as the sort of geodetic spatial infrastructure is concerned, there's now talk about using any electronic device that emits a signal as a ruler, an electronic ruler. I mean, most of these devices that we use today for day-to-day communication and so on are transmitted on very stable carrier waves, and they can easily augment what we experience so beautifully with GNSS on the outside world here inside. So each and every one of our cell phones could become a pseudo-satellite from which we can position other devices. So there's this movement called FOAM. Have you heard of FOAM? They seem to be talking about the decentralization of positioning capacities by making every electronic device that emits a signal a means of measurement.
Which is a fascinating subject and one that I wish we had time to discuss.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up before the shepherd's crooks come out and they drag us off the stage. But with that, we get a big round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.
Thanks.
And please go check out our paper if you'd like to learn more about any of what was discussed here. On our website, newamerica.org. Our program is the Future of Property
So,
Rights.
Anne, I've got to run to the airport now.
It was great to finally meet you.